Hey guys, welcome back to the Sleep Atlas. Tonight we're sinking beneath the waves into a mystery that refuses to stay drowned. You've heard of Atlantis. Maybe you've even drifted off to its story before. But there's another legend, older, quieter, stranger. A lost continent said to lie beneath the Indian and Pacific Oceans. A civilization erased not by war or gods, but by time itself. They called it Lemuria. Before we begin, a small favor. For more unique journeys through history to help you sleep, please subscribe. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim your lights, get comfortable, and imagine the sound of water. Soft waves lapping at a forgotten shore, the moonlight stretching endlessly over the sea, and somewhere beneath miles of blue silence, a world that once was, or maybe still is, waiting to be remembered. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Whisper Beneath the Waves. Myths of a Sunken World. There's a strange kind of memory that doesn't belong to anyone. It's not written down, not passed through family stories or sacred texts. It just lingers. It's the feeling that something vast has been lost. That maybe before our cities and our maps, before the noise and the neon, there was something greater, something beautiful, something that sank. Every culture seems to remember it. A paradise drowned, a homeland taken by the sea, a catastrophe that feels less like myth and more like a nightmare we all somehow share. Floods, deluges, tempests, the gods punish the proud, or nature reclaims what man built too high. But what if just once one of those stories was true? Picture it. A vast land bridging the oceans. Emerald mountains, golden plains, temples rising above tropical forests, merchants sailing between ports that no longer exist, a people so advanced that even the waves could not wash their memory away. This was the dream of Lemuria, the ghost continent that would haunt maps, mystics, and scientists alike for centuries. The story begins, as most strange things do, with a question no one could answer. Why were there lemurs in both Madagascar and India, but nowhere in between? In the 19th century, long before continental drift was accepted, naturalists stared at the globe and wondered if there had once been a bridge, a land that connected the islands and vanished beneath the sea. It sounded simple, rational even, a scientific explanation for something puzzling. But as with all good ideas, it began to mutate. A missing land turned into a lost civilization. A geological gap became a spiritual void. And into that void, humanity poured its deepest longings. For innocence, for harmony, for a time when we were still one with the earth. But before we reach the Victorians and their maps, we have to go back further. To the ancient whispers that predate the word Lemuria entirely. The world's first storytellers already knew this tale. They didn't call it a continent, they called it home. In southern India, old Tamil songs speak of Kumari Kandam, a kingdom that once stretched far beyond the tip of the subcontinent, lush and thriving until the ocean rose and took it away. They said the poets of that drowned land wrote verses so perfect that the sea, in jealousy, swallowed them whole. Far across the world, the Polynesians remembered something similar. A land beneath the waves, destroyed by fire and water, where their ancestors once lived among gods. Even in Greece, Plato wrote of Atlantis, another sunken empire whose arrogance doomed it. Different names, different coasts, but the same dream retold like a lullaby. It's hard to ignore how consistent this memory is. From the Andes to the Aegean, from the Pacific Islands to the Indian Ocean, people keep remembering a flood that erased an age of wonder. And deep down, maybe we all feel it, that sense of displacement, that quiet ache for a home we can't quite remember, because maybe it was never supposed to last. Imagine yourself standing on a beach at dusk. The air is heavy and warm, salt clinging to your skin. The tide pulls at your feet like it's trying to remind you of something. Something ancient and patient and sad. You stare out at the horizon, and for a split second, you think you see it. The faint shape of towers under the water like ghosts of stone or memories refusing to fade. That's how every myth of Lemuria begins, not with evidence, but with a feeling, a whisper in the waves, a story that feels older than our species. And as the night deepens, you begin to wonder whether the ocean is really empty at all. Because somewhere out there, between science and sleep, between memory and myth, Lemuria is waiting. Long before Lemuria became a word on the lips of scientists and dreamers, the world was already full of stories about lands that had vanished. The ocean has always been a strange kind of storyteller. It erases and reveals, buries and remembers. Every wave feels like a turning page, and every coastline is a half-finished sentence. Picture the early cartographers, hunched over candlelit desks, sketching the edges of the known world with trembling quills. The ink bleeds slightly into the parchment, and in those uncertain spaces between continents they draw monsters, gods, or the occasional island that no one has ever actually seen. The unexplored ocean was too empty to leave blank, so they filled it with imagination. Somewhere between Madagascar and Indonesia, between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, a great landmass began to appear on maps, sometimes faint, sometimes bold, sometimes labeled with strange names like Lemuria, Mu, or the Great Southern Continent. The map makers weren't lying. They were guessing, the way children guess where a missing puzzle piece might fit. Even scientists once believed the world's balance demanded another continent. If there was land in the north, surely there had to be land in the south, something to keep the earth steady. They called it Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. For centuries, explorers sailed south, chasing this phantom, convinced they would find it glimmering on the horizon. But what's fascinating is how this idea of a vast drowned land didn't belong to any one culture. It drifted, it adapted, it appeared in new myths like sea foam reforming after a wave. In India's deep south, the Sangam texts, poetic anthologies written thousands of years ago, describe an ancient Tamil kingdom called Kumari Kandam. It was said to be a paradise of scholars and kings, where philosophy and poetry flowed like rivers. But the sea, they said, grew jealous of its beauty and rose to swallow it. Only fragments of its wisdom survived. The rest sleeps beneath the Indian Ocean. Move eastward to Indonesia and you'll hear another version. The islands there, scattered like jewels across the water, were once connected, part of a vast land that sank after a great fire from the sky. To this day, older generations on Java and Sumatra speak of ancestors who walked between the islands long before boats existed. And in Polynesia, thousands of miles across the Pacific, the same memories resurface. Islands that disappeared, gods who punished humanity with waves. The Maori tell of Hawaii, a homeland beneath the sea. The Hawaiians speak of Kanehunamoku, a sunken realm of peace and abundance. Everywhere the pattern repeats. It's as though the ocean itself is humming one continuous song, and each culture remembers a verse. Of course, modern science has its own explanations. Climate change at the end of the Ice Age, rising sea levels swallowing ancient shorelines. But there's something almost poetic in how these collective memories persist. Even when facts change, the dream refuses to die. Imagine living in a world before satellites or sonar, a world where the ocean was truly bottomless. Every time a ship vanished in a storm, every time an island appeared on the horizon then faded in fog, it must have felt like the planet itself was alive, breathing, hiding, reshaping. When sailors saw underwater volcanoes or reefs rising from nowhere, they believed the sea was revealing pieces of a world that once stood above it. And maybe, in a way, they were right. The earth does forget. Continents drift, mountains crumble, and coastlines drown. Every island is a memory trying not to disappear. Now, imagine those first 19th century naturalists, European scientists with wide collars and wild hair, staring at the same map and wondering, could it be true? Could there really have been a land that once linked Africa, India, and Australia? A cradle for creatures that no longer existed, their fossils scattered like breadcrumbs. That's where the myth began to evolve, when curiosity met coincidence, when myth met science, because all it takes is one unanswered question to awaken the imagination of an entire century. The whisper of the sea became a hypothesis became a theory, and a theory would soon become a legend. In the next chapter of this mystery, the oceans don't just hide myth, they give birth to science itself. But before that transformation, let's linger a little longer here in the realm of story and superstition, where sailors still see phantom islands at dusk and poets still hear drowned cities ringing beneath the waves. Because somewhere out there, under the same stars you see tonight, there may still be ruins waiting for light. Every civilization has a story about the sea deciding to take something back. It's one of the oldest stories we tell, older than writing, older than agriculture, maybe even older than language itself. The flood, the great drowning, the moment the world was washed clean. And when you start comparing them, these myths, scattered across continents, separated by oceans, begin to sound suspiciously familiar. In Mesopotamia, long before the Bible, the Sumerians told of a man named Ziusudra, warned by the gods that a deluge would sweep away mankind. He built a massive boat, loaded it with seeds and animals, and survived, while everything else sank beneath brown waters thick with silt. Sound familiar? Thousands of years later, the same story was rewritten as Noah's Ark. In India's ancient Sanskrit texts, the god Vishnu took the form of a fish, Matsya, to warn King Manu of an oncoming flood. Manu built a boat, tied it to the horn of the divine fish, and rode out the storm as mountains vanished beneath the ocean. It ends the same way. The waters retreat, the earth is renewed, and a new age begins. Half a world away in the Americas, the Aztecs remembered a similar event, a flood that drowned giants and reset creation. In Greece, Zeus flooded the earth to punish human pride, and Deucalion and Pyrrha repopulated the world by casting stones over their shoulders that turned into people. In Polynesia, Maui lifted islands from the sea that had been lost to earlier floods. It's everywhere, always the same rhythm: hubris, warning, water, silence. So, what are we remembering? Science says that around 12,000 years ago, as the last ice age thawed, the Earth's oceans rose by more than 400 feet. Imagine that for a second. Entire coastlines disappeared. Villages turned into reefs. Valleys became bays. The planet remade itself in a single human lifetime. If you live near the sea, and most people did, it would have felt like the gods were punishing you. To the survivors, the ocean didn't just rise, it betrayed them. Picture it, fields turning to marsh, rivers reversing their flow, salt creeping into wells, the sound of distant waves growing louder each year. You'd pack your few belongings, look back at the drowned place that used to be home, and tell your children a story, not of tides or glaciers, but of divine wrath. Because in that world, nature didn't just happen, it decided. Now, fast forward a few millennia, and those memories become religion, poetry, and bedtime stories whispered beside fires. Over time, the details fade, but the core emotion remains. Something enormous was lost, and we are the orphans of that loss. It's here that the legend of Lemuria finds its deepest root. Because while Atlantis became the story of pride punished, Lemuria became the story of memory itself, of a world we somehow remember but can't quite prove existed. In southern India, Tamil poets described Kumari Kandam, that drowned kingdom of virtue and beauty. They said 3 ancient academies of knowledge, sangams, were held before the seas took them. The first 2, completely gone. The third, a faint echo of what once was. It's the perfect metaphor for human history. Every age believes it is the last remnant of something greater. And what makes these myths so haunting is not the flood itself, but what it left behind. The ruins, the fragments, the silence. Beneath the waves, the world doesn't die. It lingers. Coral grows over statues. Fish swim through windows once carved by human hands. In time, it becomes difficult to tell where nature ends and memory begins. Even now, modern divers have found the remains of Dwarka, an ancient city off India's western coast, its streets eerily preserved in sand. In Japan, near Yonaguni, megalithic terraces rise from the seafloor, carved so precisely that debate still rages, natural formation or man-made monument swallowed by the sea. Each discovery reignites the dream. Maybe the flood myths weren't myths at all. Maybe Lemuria, or whatever we choose to call it, wasn't a fantasy, but a distorted memory of a real, drowned world. But here's where the story deepens, because the legend of Lemuria isn't really about finding ruins under the sea. It's about the human need to fill the silence. We look at the ocean, endless, unknowable, untamed, and we can't stand not knowing what's under there. So we build stories like bridges, trying to connect what we see with what we feel we've lost. The mind hates a blank space, the heart even more, and Lemuria became that bridge, not just between continents, but between science and faith, between what we can prove and what we can dream. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of the ocean tonight. The tide pulls back, slow and heavy. The air smells like salt and dusk. Waves collapse in slow motion, each one whispering a name you can't quite catch. That's Lemuria. Not a place, but a question that refuses to sink. Because maybe deep down the ocean remembers everything we've ever built, every city, every prayer, every secret, all of it, just waiting to be retold. Let's take a quiet step from the world of gods and myths into something equally mysterious, but wearing a lab coat. It's the 19th century. The world smells like coal smoke and damp paper. Steamships churn across oceans. Telegraph wires hum like metallic vines, and explorers fill sketchbooks with half-remembered coastlines. This was an age when people believed they were finally understanding the Earth, classifying, mapping, measuring everything. And yet, in that same moment of rational confidence, the human imagination slipped through the cracks and created one of the strangest scientific ghosts ever conceived, Lemuria. It began, as so many strange ideas do, with a small and annoying problem. A zoologist named Philip Lutley Sclater, working in the 1860s, noticed something that didn't make sense. He was studying lemurs, those wide-eyed, ghostly primates from Madagascar, and he realized their fossils appeared in two very distant places, Madagascar and India, but not in Africa, not in the Middle East, nothing in between. How could that be? How could a species leap across an entire ocean without leaving a trace? Sclater didn't have tectonic plates or continental drift or the concept of seafloor spreading to fall back on. None of that existed yet. So, using the tools he did have, logic, curiosity, and a pencil, he drew a map and imagined what might once have been a land bridge, a lost continent. He called it Lemuria, the land of lemurs, a poetic name for what was, at first, a very pragmatic idea. It was supposed to be scientific, just geology with a touch of guesswork, but something about it, the word, the imagery, felt mythic. Lemuria, the syllables hum like a lullaby, like the sound of the sea against stone. Sclater had unknowingly built a stage, and soon the world's dreamers would fill it. Because in the 19th century, this kind of theory wasn't absurd. Scientists were still trying to explain how the world's continents fit together, how identical fossils could be found in far-flung lands, how strange coral species appeared thousands of miles apart. So when Sclater proposed a lost continent beneath the Indian Ocean, people didn't laugh. They nodded, took notes, and drew it onto maps. Soon, geologists, biologists, and explorers were expanding his idea, sketching vast continents that once stretched from Africa to Australia. Some even believed Lemuria had been the bridge between humanity's earliest ancestors, a literal stepping stone of evolution. And then, like all good myths pretending to be science, it began to evolve. The Victorians, for all their stiff collars and moral restraint, were addicted to wonder. They collected fossils and fairies with equal enthusiasm. They believed in ghosts and Darwin at the same time. It was an age where the rational and the mystical shared a cup of tea and politely disagreed about everything. So the idea of Lemuria, half science, half dream, fit right in. Picture the scene, a smoky London parlour, shelves sagging with geological charts and exotic shells. A man in a waistcoat leans over a map and traces a finger across the Indian Ocean. "Here," he whispers, "once lay an entire world." Outside, rain taps against glass. Inside, imaginations ignite. The power of Lemuria wasn't in its proof, but in its potential. It explained what couldn't yet be explained, a shortcut for the gaps in human knowledge, and humans love gaps. They're the perfect size for stories to slip into. But there's something beautifully ironic about this moment. Lemuria was meant to bring order, a tidy explanation for a zoological puzzle. But what it actually did was unleash chaos. Because once an idea leaves the lab and enters the public imagination, it doesn't stay tidy. Within decades, Lemuria had migrated out of scientific journals and into novels, seances, and esoteric circles. The continent that started as a way to connect fossil dots had become a stage for humanity's spiritual longings. The scientist's pen had accidentally drawn a portal. Still, for a short time, Lemuria belonged to science, or at least to the kind of science that smelled of salt water and pipe smoke. Its maps appeared in natural history books. Its theories were debated in royal societies. And for every skeptic who scoffed, another quietly wondered if maybe, just maybe, there really was a continent beneath the waves, waiting to be found. It was, in a way, the perfect Victorian fantasy, rational discovery dressed in romantic mystery. But there's an even deeper irony here. Everything the Victorians thought they needed Lemuria to explain, the movement of species, the shape of continents, the similarities between far-off lands, was true. They were just wrong about the mechanism. A few decades later, Alfred Wegener would propose continental drift, the real reason Madagascar and India share their fossils. But by then, Lemuria had already escaped the world of science and slipped quietly into the world of myth, where no discovery could kill it. It's almost poetic. A scientific mistake becomes a legend. A zoological curiosity becomes a civilization. The ocean once again swallows fact and returns mystery. Imagine for a moment Sklyter himself, alone at his desk late at night, surrounded by fossils and candlelight. Ink stains his fingers and his map glows faintly under the flicker of flame. He doesn't know he's naming a myth. He thinks he's describing the Earth, but in truth, he's giving humanity a new Atlantis, a dream shaped like science, because that's what Lemuria really is, a place where logic and longing meet, shake hands, and decide not to tell anyone they're secretly the same thing. Imagine standing on the deck of a ship in the middle of the Indian Ocean. It's just past midnight. The world is nothing but water and wind. The waves rise and fall like breathing, slow, patient, ancient. Beneath that surface, 2 miles down, is darkness so complete it might as well be eternity. If you could dive deep enough far below the light, what would you find? Smooth plains of silt, cold mountains older than language, valleys where sound itself moves differently, and maybe, if you let your imagination drift, the faint outline of something impossible, a staircase swallowed by coral, a pillar half buried in sand, a ruin that hums like memory. That's the spell Lemuria cast, even as science moved on, even as new theories of continental drift rose to replace it. The name lingered. It clung to maps, to books, to the collective imagination like a whisper that refused to drown. Lemuria had become less a place and more a question. And the ocean, of course, loves questions. You can't really blame people for holding on to it. The ocean is humanity's favorite mystery. It hides 95% of itself from us. Whole mountain ranges, canyons deeper than the Grand Canyon, rivers of salt water flowing beneath the sea, all invisible, unknowable, indifferent. So when scientists told the world there was no Lemuria, the world quietly replied, "Maybe you just haven't looked deep enough." And that's the funny thing about knowledge. It doesn't erase wonder, it just changes its shape. By the early 20th century, maps of Lemuria had started to fade. Plate tectonics slowly took its throne, explaining what Lemuria once had. The textbooks replaced lost continents with moving plates, magma plumes, and subduction zones. But even as the science became sharper, the dream stayed soft around the edges. Writers, poets, mystics, they couldn't let it go. Lemuria was too poetic, too haunting, too right on some intuitive level to abandon. The earth felt ancient and alive, and somewhere deep down, humans felt sure they'd forgotten something, maybe a place, maybe a truth, maybe both. And so, the ocean became the stand-in for that loss. It's strange, isn't it? We've mapped the stars with more precision than the sea beneath us. We send satellites to the edges of the solar system, but we still don't fully understand what's under the waves. Maybe that's why the myth of Lemuria lingers, because the ocean is the last believable hiding place for mystery. Take a moment to picture it. The slow roll of waves under moonlight, the hiss of foam curling over the sand, the scent of salt and something older, something faintly metallic, like the memory of a world before ours. People say the ocean is indifferent, but that's not quite true. It remembers. Every tide is a repetition, every current a rhythm older than civilization. When we look out at that horizon, we're not seeing emptiness, we're seeing history's amnesia. That's what Lemuria became, the name for everything we lost to water. In old seafarers' tales, sailors claimed to hear strange sounds through the hulls of their ships, long, low groans that rose from the deep at night. They called it the ocean's breathing. Modern science calls it seismic activity. But to the romantic mind, it's easy to imagine something else, a vast echo of the world that once was. You can laugh, but there's a reason every myth eventually sinks. It's not just metaphorical. Flood myths, drowned cities, vanishing shores, they're the subconscious voice of a species that built its first homes too close to the sea. When the tides rose, we didn't just lose land, we lost stories, names, memories, and maybe that's what Lemuria is, a stand-in for every story that water erased. Let's be clear, if you drain the oceans today, you wouldn't find a single Lemurian temple, no shining domes, no golden statues, no proof of an ancient utopia. What you'd see instead are scars, tectonic trenches, volcanic scars, long fractures where the earth itself split and moved. You'd see something more humbling and, in its way, more beautiful. You'd see time made visible. The ocean floor is the Earth's memory written in pressure and heat, and in that sense, Lemuria is real, not as a place, but as an idea. It's the human instinct to fill the silence with meaning, to look at a horizon and imagine what lies beneath it. Because sometimes, myth is just the mind's way of refusing to accept that forgetting is permanent. And so Lemuria endures, not on any map, not in any textbook, but in the same place Atlantis lives, just below consciousness, shimmering faintly in the deep part of our collective mind where science and dream blur together. It's there every time someone stares into the sea and wonders why it feels both familiar and alien. It's there when divers find the ruins of Dwarka off the coast of India or Yonaguni off Japan and whisper that maybe, just maybe, the old stories were right after all. The ocean doesn't answer, of course. It never does. It just keeps breathing, a long, patient rhythm that sounds almost like thought. And maybe that's the truest ending to this chapter. Lemuria isn't lost because it never existed, but the longing for it, the quiet ache that something precious slipped away before we could write it down, that's real. That's the pulse you hear when you listen to the sea. So as the waves settle and the myths drift back into silence, take a moment. Picture that ancient invisible world beneath the surface. The light fades, the water cools, the ruins vanish again, and above it all the ocean exhales, calm, endless, indifferent, still guarding the secrets we keep inventing for it. Chapter 2. The Scientists Who Dreamed of Continents. Take a deep breath. Imagine the ocean again, still and endless, but this time picture the year 1864. The age of discovery is slowly giving way to the age of reason. Steamships are tracing neat white scars across the blue. Telegraph lines are crawling across continents, and the map of the world, once full of dragons, mermaids, and here-be monsters, is finally being filled in with railroads and coastlines. And yet, in the middle of all that logic, something strange happens. Science, the great myth breaker, accidentally gives birth to a myth of its own. It begins not in a temple or a legend, but in the study of a tired English zoologist surrounded by lemur skulls. His name was Philip Lutley Sclater, and in 1864 he noticed something odd. Lemurs, those wide-eyed, haunting little primates, existed in both Madagascar and India, but not in Africa or the Middle East. There was no logical way they could have crossed the vast open ocean between those two places, unless, Sclater reasoned, they hadn't needed to cross at all. He proposed calmly and scientifically that there must once have been a land bridge, a vanished continent, connecting Madagascar and India across what is now the Indian Ocean. A sunken world that explained why certain animals appeared on opposite sides of the sea. He called it Lemuria after the lemurs themselves. It's almost funny, isn't it? One man trying to explain an inconvenient fossil record unknowingly gave us one of the great modern legends. Lemuria wasn't meant to be mystical. It was meant to be practical, a neat solution, a bridge of dirt and reason connecting dots on a map. But humans don't stay practical for long, especially when mystery is involved, because Sclater's idea that there had once been a lost continent beneath the waves landed in the middle of the Victorian imagination like a match dropped into dry paper. This was the century of Darwin and Dickens, of exploration and empire, of steam and superstition living side by side. People were obsessed with origins, where species came from, where civilization came from, where we came from. And suddenly here was this scientific man saying that maybe once upon a time there had been an entire missing world connecting east and west. A world that had vanished, leaving only fossils and whispers behind. You can almost see the excitement spread. Geologists, biologists, and philosophers began speculating about what else might have been lost down there. Were there ancient forests, primitive humans, civilizations older than Egypt? Newspapers picked up the story, of course. Victorians loved a mystery that came with Latin terminology, and before long Lemuria became the polite man's Atlantis, not a myth, but a hypothesis respectable enough to discuss over tea. There's something almost endearing about that. You have to remember that this was before plate tectonics, before the idea of continents drifting apart made sense. Scientists were trying to explain patterns of life that didn't fit, and so they filled in the blanks with imagination, not out of foolishness, but out of the same human impulse that had drawn sailors toward the horizon for centuries, curiosity. But curiosity can be dangerous when it's mixed with beauty. Once Lemuria existed on paper, it began to exist in the mind. Artists painted glowing maps of the Indian Ocean, shaded with ghostly coastlines. Theaters produced travelogues of imaginary expeditions to the sunken land of the lemurs. Even scientists started speaking about it as if it had a certain romance. Because let's be clear, science in the Victorian era was not purely scientific. It was also theatrical. Discoveries were presented like performances. Each new fossil, each strange creature from a distant island was part of a grand narrative about progress, destiny, and the human place in nature. Lemuria, in that sense, became the perfect stage, a missing continent between East and West, between science and mystery, between what could be measured and what could only be imagined. It also arrived at a moment when Europe was obsessed with connection. Telegraphs were shrinking distance. Colonial empires were uniting distant lands under one flag, and the dream of a single world, scientifically mapped and spiritually understood, felt almost within reach. Lemuria became the natural metaphor for that dream, a bridge, a unifying thread across oceans. But there's a quiet irony hiding beneath all this optimism, because the very people who championed reason were also haunted by the fear that reason might strip the world of wonder. Darwin had told them they were descended from apes. Geologists had told them the Earth was older than Genesis. Astronomers had told them that the stars were not gods, but furnaces. The Victorian mind, for all its progress, secretly longed for magic, and Lemuria offered a compromise. Here was a myth that didn't insult science. It didn't need miracles or angels or divine wrath. It simply required the sea to be a little deeper and time to be a little longer. It allowed people to believe in the beauty of mystery without having to renounce the authority of reason. Lemuria was the middle ground, the rational man's fantasy. Soon, the name began appearing everywhere, in essays, travel journals, even novels. Scientists who'd never seen the Indian Ocean began to reference it confidently, drawing its shape on maps, giving it coastlines, rivers, and mountain ranges. Lemuria went from hypothesis to geography in record time, an entire continent born from a footnote. But something subtle began to shift. As more people spoke of it, Lemuria stopped being an explanation and started becoming an obsession. The scientific theory slowly bled into something warmer, more poetic, an intuition that maybe this lost land wasn't just about lemurs at all. Maybe it was about us, about something humanity had lost. Connection, innocence, unity, now buried under miles of water. And that's where the trouble begins. Because when facts end, stories begin. And the story of Lemuria, once it escaped the laboratory, was about to take on a life that science could never contain. For now, though, picture the world of Philip Sclater, gas lamps flickering against the windows of London, the smell of coal smoke hanging over the Thames, and a scholar at his desk tracing with ink the outline of a vanished continent no one had ever seen. Somewhere outside it's raining. Somewhere in Madagascar, lemurs are calling through the night, and between them, in the dark sea, a myth is quietly being born. Close your eyes for a moment and picture a London study in the late 1800s. The air smells faintly of old paper, pipe smoke, and damp wool. A globe spins slowly by lamplight, its surface crisscrossed with neat red pencil lines. A man in a waistcoat leans over it, his face half in shadow, muttering softly to himself. He isn't dreaming of Atlantis or Eden. He's drafting a continent that doesn't exist. And yet, somehow, everyone is starting to believe that it might, because by the late 19th century, Lemuria had escaped from the footnotes of science journals and wandered straight into the collective imagination. It was no longer just a land bridge for lemurs, it was a canvas for dreams. Think about the mood of the age. Victorians were explorers by day and mystics by night. They invented telegraphs and seances in the same breath. They charted Africa with rifles and compasses, then came home to draw spirit maps of the afterlife. They were building railways across India while publishing books about fairies in Devonshire. It was an era that believed everything could be discovered, even the divine. And so, when a theory appeared suggesting there might once have been an entire hidden world beneath the Indian Ocean, the Victorians didn't just analyze it, they fell in love with it. They loved it for its romance, for its symmetry, and most of all, for its possibility. Because Lemuria wasn't just another island, it was an entire missing chapter of Earth's history. It could explain everything, from why certain species were scattered across continents, to why human civilizations seemed to rise and fall in mysterious cycles. Soon maps began to appear in atlases, drawn not by geologists but by artists. Great curving land masses stretched from Madagascar to India, curling south toward Australia like the arm of a sleeping giant. Some were shaded in gold, some in green, some with tiny mountain ranges rising where no ship had ever sailed. These weren't scientific diagrams. They were visual lullabies, comforting in their order, soothing in their logic. To a society wrestling with Darwin's theory of evolution, with the idea that humanity wasn't divinely placed but accidentally evolved, Lemuria offered a softer alternative, a middle ground between Genesis and geology. Here was a land that could hold the missing links, a place where life's mysteries could gather quietly beneath the waves, safe from the unsettling glare of reason. But the beauty of the idea wasn't just in what it explained, it was in what it implied. If there had once been a lost world beneath the sea, then the ocean itself became sacred, a living memory of a vanished age. And Victorians adored that sort of poetry disguised as science. Writers began to weave Lemuria into their novels. Poets spoke of drowned continents, of civilizations swallowed by tides but not forgotten by time. Even clergy found comfort in it. Sermons quietly folded the idea into metaphors of divine punishment and renewal. It seemed that everyone, from naturalists to theologians, could project their own beliefs onto the blue expanse of the Indian Ocean. The French geologist Édouard Suez, one of the era's most respected thinkers, even adopted the concept, though he gave it a new name, Gondwanaland. To him, it wasn't mystical at all, just the logical result of continents shifting long before humans existed. He was closer to being right than he knew, but his work, published decades before the theory of plate tectonics, still shared the same haunting undertone that the Earth was older, deeper, and more fragile than anyone had imagined. There's something deeply human about that impulse, the desire to fill silence with story. Every time science draws a blank, imagination rushes in like a tide, and the Victorians were masters of that kind of imaginative substitution. When they couldn't explain fossils, they pictured giants. When they couldn't explain pyramids, they dreamed of Atlanteans. And when they found lemurs on opposite sides of an ocean, they conjured a lost continent, Lemuria, bridging two worlds. In a way, they were trying to comfort themselves. The Industrial Revolution had changed everything. The world was becoming mechanical, urban, and loud. Faith was shrinking under microscopes, and progress, though dazzling, was also terrifying. Lemuria became a place to put that anxiety. It was nostalgia disguised as geology, a dream of a simpler, more organic Earth where everything connected in harmony. And so, through magazines and coffeehouse debates, the myth of Lemuria began to grow legs. It became a polite conversation topic, exotic, safe, and fashionable. By the 1880s, even popular science lectures began referencing it, complete with painted panoramas showing lush tropical forests, giant ferns, and early mammals roaming through sunlight that no longer reached the surface. You can almost imagine the audience, men in top hats, women in lace gloves, their faces glowing orange in the gaslight as they leaned forward in fascination. The lecturer gestures toward the painted map. Here, he says, beneath these waters may once have stretched an entire world. And for a few seconds, no one breathes, because even the most skeptical minds secretly want to believe in something beautiful that's been lost. But here's the irony. The very idea that began as a tidy, rational explanation would soon be too beautiful for science to contain. As the 20th century approached, the maps of imagination would outlast the data. Lemuria, like all great myths, was about to evolve. It would leave behind its fossils and geology textbooks and find a new home, not in laboratories, but in seance rooms, temples, and secret societies. Because when science stops believing in something, mystics are always waiting to pick it up. But before that transformation begins, picture one last moment, the twilight of the Victorian age, A calm evening in London, the rain tapping softly against the window panes of the Royal Geographical Society. Inside, maps of the known world hang neatly on the wall, every border carefully drawn. But in the corner, near the Indian Ocean, there's still a faint outline, a shadow of land where no land should be. And even now, if you squint, you can almost see it. A memory half erased, half dreamed. A reminder that the edge of the map is never really the end, only the beginning of wonder. Picture the Earth as the Victorians imagined it, solid, static, obedient, a planet made of clockwork gears, not drifting plates. Continents didn't move back then. They sat where God or geology had placed them, like furniture in a divine drawing room. So when scientists like Philip Sclater proposed that Madagascar and India were once connected by a land bridge, a vast continent now sunk beneath the waves, it wasn't fantasy, it was logic. Because if the continents could not move, then something else had to. A missing piece, a lost world to fill the gaps. In 1864, Sclater published The Mammals of Madagascar, quietly suggesting that lemurs, those wide-eyed ghosts of the forest, were the last remnants of a vanished homeland. He named it Lemuria after them, with the tidy precision of a man who probably never imagined he was creating a legend. But the Earth in the 19th century was a puzzle no one could solve. Fossils appeared in all the wrong places. Coral reefs existed where ancient ice sheets once lay. Seashells were found on mountaintops. The story of the planet refused to sit still, and so began the golden age of what we might call geological storytelling. Theories elegant, wrong, and strangely poetic. One camp insisted that entire continents had risen and fallen repeatedly, like breathing. They called it oscillation theory, the Earth itself inhaling and exhaling through time. Another proposed that islands were the peaks of drowned mountains, fragments of lost lands. Others whispered that volcanoes were valves of a living planet, releasing its inner heat so that it wouldn't crack apart. To us, these ideas sound quaint, but in their time they were revolutionary. Imagine standing on a cliff above the sea with no satellites, no sonar, no sense of the Earth's crust shifting beneath you. Only intuition, fossils, and faith. You'd look at the horizon and think, surely something once stretched across there. Surely the world wouldn't be built with pieces missing. That was the emotional heart of Lemuria, the refusal to believe in gaps. Victorian science, for all its rationality, still craved symmetry. Every question had to have an answer that fit neatly into the map. And if the answer wasn't visible, they would invent one elegant enough to feel true. This was also an era before the word extinction had fully sunk in. Species might vanish, but entire worlds, that felt unbearable. A sunken continent offered a gentler story. Not death, just disappearance. The Earth is a great stage where civilizations and ecosystems could step off for a while, waiting for their next cue. And there's something quietly tragic about that, isn't there? The yearning to believe that nothing truly ends. It just hides. Even Charles Darwin, who'd already scandalized the world with evolution, wrestled with the same mystery. On his voyage aboard the Beagle, he noticed chains of islands, Galapagos, Cape Verde, the Pacific atolls, each with species found nowhere else. He saw coral reefs forming where volcanoes sank, and he wondered if entire land masses could really vanish beneath the waves. He called it subsidence theory. Darwin, in his calm way, had already brushed against Lemuria without realizing it. He saw that the Earth was alive, not literally breathing, but changing, moving, restless beneath its surface calm. The difference was, He didn't need a missing continent to make sense of it. He just needed time, billions of years of it. But time, to the Victorians, was still too terrifying. The idea that the world could be that old, that humanity was just a recent accident on a slowly shifting planet, was almost too big to bear. So they scaled it down again. They filled the silence with stories. If Darwin's world was fluid and endless, Lemuria's was tidy and complete. A continent that sank was tragic but comprehensible. Continents that moved, that was chaos. And so, even as scientific evidence began to erode the idea, the myth held strong. It survived because it was emotionally correct, if not scientifically so. Picture an old map on yellowed parchment, oceans a pale blue, continents in faded tan. Between Madagascar and India, someone has drawn faint pencil marks, a chain of islands, then a ghostly outline of land. In the corner, a note. Possible site of Lemuria. That tiny line, that suggestion of continuity, comforted people. It said, the world makes sense, the pieces fit, the past can still be recovered. But in the early 20th century, everything changed. A quiet, eccentric German meteorologist named Alfred Wegener looked at those same maps and saw not lost land but movement, the continents themselves drifting slowly apart like rafts. He called it continental drift. It was ridiculed at first, of course. Too strange, too fluid, too un-Victorian. But in time, it would bury Lemuria once and for all. And yet, ironically, Wegener's theory proved the old myth right in spirit. Yes, there were lost worlds beneath the waves. Yes, continents had vanished, just not the way anyone had imagined. It wasn't divine punishment or sudden catastrophe. It was slow, geological choreography. The earth itself dancing, reshaping, recycling its own skin. If Lemuria was a ghost, then plate tectonics would be the seance that summoned its truth. But that's still decades away. For now, imagine those scientists in their dusty studies, turning globes under candlelight, arguing over fossils and sea charts, convinced that they're decoding the planet's most intimate secrets. They weren't wrong to dream, they were just dreaming in the language of their time. And when their dream dissolved under the weight of new evidence, it didn't vanish. It simply drifted somewhere new. Because beautiful ideas never really die. They evolve. They change shape. They sink below the surface, waiting for the next generation to rediscover them. Just like Lemuria itself. Picture the scene, the 1870s. The air smells faintly of coal smoke and ozone. Steam engines groan in the streets, telegram wires hum overhead, and in parlors lit by gaslight, the spiritual and the scientific share the same teacup. This was the moment when the world believed in everything. Seances were as fashionable as microscopes. Mediums claimed to speak with the dead, while gentlemen geologists debated the age of the earth. The line between mysticism and method blurred so easily, because both were hunting the same thing, proof that there was more than what could be seen. And somewhere in that soft, flickering space between microscope slides and crystal balls, Lemuria slipped free of science and began a second life. When Philip Sclater first wrote of it, Lemuria had been a tidy zoological hypothesis, a missing land bridge, no stranger than anything else Victorian science had dreamed up. But as the theory of continental drift gained quiet traction and Lemuria's scientific credibility began to fade, the myth refused to die. Instead, it drifted into stranger waters. In the late 19th century, the Theosophical Society, founded by the enigmatic Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, took hold of Lemuria and transformed it completely. To the Theosophists, the Earth wasn't just a ball of rock, it was a living soul, evolving through cycles of birth and decay. Humanity, too, passed through stages, from ethereal beginnings to physical form, and Lemuria, they said, had been the cradle of one of those ancient stages, the third root race. Not modern humans, but something older, dreamlike, towering beings who communicated by thought, who breathed light, who built crystalline cities under violet suns. Science had created a continent to explain lemurs. Spiritualism resurrected it to explain us. Theosophy was a strange marriage of Eastern mysticism, Western esotericism, and Victorian guilt. It longed for unity, for an origin story that connected spirit and matter, East and West, past and present. And Lemuria was the perfect symbol, a land that had physically vanished but spiritually endured. Imagine those drawing rooms filled with incense and talk of ancient souls. Maps of invisible continents were redrawn in candlelight, tracing not coastlines, but cosmic evolution. Atlantis and Lemuria were paired like twins, two vanished realms in humanity's forgotten ancestry. One fell by greed, they said, the other by innocence. The Lemurians, in Blavatsky's vision, were not corrupted. They were pure consciousness descending into form. They were humanity learning to be human. It was science's missing link rewritten as scripture, and somehow people preferred it that way. You can almost hear the hum of the seance table, the quiet scratching of pens as stenographers recorded channeled wisdom from Lemurian spirits. Mediums described jungles of golden light, mountains of crystal, and oceans that shimmered with phosphorescent energy. There were temples that floated, animals that spoke, cities that breathed. The story had escaped reason's cage and soared straight into dream. By the early 1900s, Lemuria had become a symbol of lost enlightenment, a prehistoric utopia that existed before human corruption, before money, before war. It wasn't just a land, it was nostalgia made myth. And perhaps that's why it lasted. Because every age, no matter how rational, secretly aches for paradise. Science had offered progress, but not peace. Electric lights replaced candles, factories replaced fields, Darwin replaced Genesis. And in the clatter of modern life, people longed for something gentler, older, quieter, something like Lemuria. Even in California, half a world away from the Theosophists' London circles, the legend found new soil. By the 1930s, mystics around Mount Shasta claimed to sense Lemurian energy rising through the earth. Ancient souls living underground in glowing crystal chambers, guiding humanity's evolution through vibration and light. They said the Lemurians never died, they simply went deeper. It's easy to smile at these stories now. The white robes, the trance messages, the endless golden ages. But there's a tenderness in them too. They reveal something very human. Our refusal to accept that paradise could be truly gone. We rebuild it in our myths, our religions, even our pseudoscience. Because if we admit that no paradise ever existed, then what are we reaching for? So Lemuria became the bridge between worlds, not just between Madagascar and India, but between rationality and reverence. It allowed people to believe in progress and in mystery at the same time. You could work in a laboratory by day and attend a seance by night, and somehow it all felt part of the same story, the search for what's been lost, and that's the beautiful irony. The same curiosity that sent Sclater chasing lemur fossils sent Blavatsky chasing spiritual truth. The same hunger that drove scientists to map the ocean floor drove mystics to map the soul. Different tools, same longing. By the early 20th century, Lemuria's name had become shorthand for the lost wisdom of mankind. It showed up in pulp novels, secret societies, and whispered lectures in half-lit halls. It was invoked by early occultists, UFO enthusiasts, even Nazi mystics who imagined Aryan origins in the sunken lands. Each version warped it further, but all of them shared the same pulse, the dream of a forgotten world that once held perfect knowledge, and the quiet hope that some remnant of it might still survive beneath the sea or within us. And in a way, they were right. Because even now, when we talk about Atlantis, Mu, or ancient civilizations wiped clean by waves, we're still tracing Lemuria's shadow. It set the template for the entire genre of lost worlds. It was the myth that taught modern humanity how to long for what can't be found. So when we think of Lemuria today, whether through the eyes of science, fantasy, or faith, we're really looking at ourselves reflected in deep water. The details have changed, the continents have shifted, but the yearning remains the same. The yearning for something just beyond the horizon, something vast, beautiful, and gone. Picture a world still half unmapped, oceans swallowing more white space than ink, coastlines uncertain, and explorers still writing the word terra incognita with the reverence of a prayer. That was the world in which Lemuria was born, and it wasn't just a theory, it was a mood. Because when you live in a time where maps end, you start imagining what lies beyond their edges. You can almost feel the pull, a whisper saying, "Keep going." Even when science declared Lemuria impossible, its ghost clung stubbornly to the margins of atlases. You'd find it drawn in faint contour beneath the Indian Ocean, or hinted at with an artist's flourish near Madagascar. Sometimes it appeared as submerged continent, other times as the lost land of the lemurs. But whether listed as myth or possibility, it lived on, an ink blot between belief and discovery. Maps are never just geography, they're psychology. They show how a civilization sees itself, what it values, what it fears, what it hopes to find. And Lemuria, even when erased, revealed something profound, that human beings will always fill empty space with meaning. Take a moment and imagine one of those 19th century maps, parchment yellowed, curling at the edges, the smell of dust and salt. Tiny ships carved in ink drift across pale blue seas, and at the bottom, faintly penciled in looping script, the name Lemuria, a word that feels half lullaby, half ghost. To Victorians, that name shimmered with potential. It symbolized not just a continent, but the last great unknown, the dream that the earth still held secrets under its waves. And when that hope disappeared with the advent of modern geology, people didn't stop looking, they simply turned inward. The explorers of the 20th century were no longer crossing oceans, they were crossing consciousness. That's the quiet legacy Lemuria left behind. It trained the human imagination to expect mystery, to believe that the world's surface, whether map, ocean, or human mind, was just the beginning. It's easy to think of science and spirituality as enemies, but the truth is, both depend on the same instinct, the hunger to uncover what's hidden. Lemuria sat right between those worlds, a hinge connecting two ways of knowing. Scientists sought fossils, mystics sought memory. Both believed something was buried, they just disagreed on what. And maybe that's why Lemuria still feels relevant today. Because even though our maps are now complete, the feeling of incompleteness remains. We've charted the earth, dissected its crust, mapped the ocean floor with satellites, and yet, deep down, there's still that itch, that sense that something vast and beautiful has slipped through our fingers. When modern oceanographers look at sonar scans of drowned mountain ranges, when divers explore ruins off Yonaguni or Dwarka, they're still chasing that feeling. Not necessarily proof of Lemuria, but proof that the world is still stranger than we think. And it is. Beneath the sea, there are ridges shaped like cathedrals, volcanic scars glowing with bioluminescence, fields of coral that look like petrified gardens, entire cities of life, unseen, untouched, exist in silence, like memories turned to stone. In that sense, Lemuria was never wrong. There was another world beneath the waves. It just wasn't human. But the myth persists because it tells us something we secretly need to believe, that we are not finished discovering ourselves, that we haven't truly lost connection to something ancient and good. When you close your eyes tonight and hear the distant hum of the ocean, whether in reality or imagination, think of how it sounds like breathing, slow, rhythmic, eternal. The same rhythm that once pulled sailors toward horizons they could never reach. The same rhythm that whispers to us now through myths like Lemuria, that discovery is never really over. It just changes direction. Maybe the real continent we're trying to rediscover isn't on the seafloor. Maybe it's in the folds of the human mind, in that borderland between reason and wonder, skepticism and awe. Because the moment we stop believing in what's hidden, we stop looking, and the act of looking, that quiet, patient curiosity, is what makes civilization possible. So even though Lemuria doesn't appear on modern maps, maybe it shouldn't be erased entirely. Maybe it deserves to remain there, faint, ghost-like, not as land, but as a reminder, a whisper in the cartographer's ink saying, not everything has been found. And isn't that, in a way, comforting, to know that mystery still exists, even if it only lives in our stories? Somewhere in the ocean's darkness, amid the cold drift of currents and the glow of plankton, the idea of Lemuria still stirs, weightless, timeless, waiting for dreamers to rediscover it once more. Chapter 3, The Mystic Kingdom, Lemuria's Spiritual Rebirth. There's a moment in every story when reason sighs and steps aside, when logic grows tired of explaining the unexplainable. And that's usually when mystics appear, quiet, patient, waiting in the wings with candles and symbols and the promise that they can make sense of what science abandoned. That's what happened to Lemuria. By the late 19th century, the scientific world had politely folded the Lemuria hypothesis and placed it in the drawer labeled interesting but incorrect. Continental drift and plate tectonics hadn't yet been proven, but the fossil mystery that birthed Lemuria had lost its luster. To scientists, the lost continent was just another casualty of overzealous theorizing. But to the spiritual seekers of the Victorian age, that scientific silence sounded like an invitation. Imagine the world around 1880. Gaslight flickers in London drawing rooms, steam trains cut through fog, and beneath that modern hum, a strange hunger grows, not for money or conquest, but for meaning. It's the age of seances, of mesmerism, of secret societies that promise hidden knowledge in an industrial world that feels increasingly hollow. Science explains how, but no one can quite explain why. Enter Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, Russian mystic, philosopher, and depending on who you ask, either a genius or a fraud. She co-founded the Theosophical Society, a movement that claimed to uncover the spiritual truths behind all religions, weaving together Hinduism, Buddhism and Western esotericism into one sprawling cosmic tapestry. And somewhere in her labyrinth of ideas, Lemuria found a new home. To Blavatsky, Lemuria wasn't just a lost land. It was a sacred origin, the cradle of an ancient root race that predated humanity as we know it. She described it as a continent of luminous beings, neither entirely physical nor entirely spirit, who lived in harmony with the earth before the world descended into materialism. In her cosmology, Lemurians were dreamlike ancestors, towering figures who communicated telepathically, glowed within a light, and eventually fell, giving rise to Atlantis and then to us. It's easy to scoff, but you have to understand the context. Victorian society was addicted to discovery. Darwin's Origin of Species had cracked open the door to human evolution, and the world was reeling from the implications. If humanity evolved, where did consciousness come from? What about the soul? Was there a bridge between biology and divinity? Blavatsky offered that bridge, fragile though it was, spun from myth and mysticism. Lemuria, she said, was proof that we were once more than flesh, that we had forgotten our spiritual origins in the rush to master the material world. Her followers ate it up, and suddenly Lemuria, a name once confined to scientific journals, was reincarnated in crystal parlors and candlelit reading rooms. It wasn't a landmass anymore, it was an idea, a lost paradise, buried not under water, but under time. Take a moment and imagine her version of Lemuria, not the rational land of fossils and tectonics, but a living, breathing Eden under a perpetual sunrise. Vast fern forests stretch across the horizon, crystal towers shimmer above tropical canopies. The air hums faintly with energy. The inhabitants are tall, golden-skinned, their eyes soft and luminous, their thoughts flowing like song. They don't speak, they resonate. For people burnt out by the soot and machinery of industrial cities, this vision was irresistible. Lemuria became a balm, a mythic counterpoint to the choking fog of London or the restless clatter of New York. It was everything the modern world wasn't. Quiet, pure, harmonious, and maybe that's why it spread so fast. By the early 1900s, Theosophy had followers from San Francisco to Bombay. It gave people something religion no longer could, a sense of cosmic continuity, not heaven above or hell below, but civilizations beneath the waves, spiritual evolution unfolding like coral growth through the ages. Even scientists, secretly or not, were intrigued. There's always been a quiet romance between reason and faith, two lovers who pretend to ignore each other across the dinner table but still keep glancing up. And Lemuria was that secret glance. The myth was so alluring that even skeptics found themselves wanting it to be true. Because if Lemuria had existed, if an entire continent had once thrived and sunk, taking with it the wisdom of an older humanity, then maybe there really was more to the world than progress, pipes, and profit. Maybe civilization wasn't advancing but forgetting. That's the paradox of myths like this. They comfort and unsettle in equal measure. They whisper that we are ancient, connected, eternal, and yet remind us how easily all things, even empires, can vanish beneath the waves. And so, by the time science moved on, Lemuria was no longer just a theory. It was a spiritual inheritance, a half-forgotten hymn passed from geologists to mystics, from explorers to dreamers. And once that happened, there was no putting it back in the drawer. It had evolved just like we had, from land to legend, from evidence to faith, and in its new shimmering form, Lemuria would soon attract even stranger interpreters, prophets, psychics, and self-styled sages who claimed not just to believe in Lemuria, but to remember it. That's where we'll go next, into the glowing, otherworldly world of the mystics who swore they could still hear the Lemurians whispering through the mountains, the crystals, and the dream. Imagine a place where the sky was never fully dark, where dawn lingered, soft and endless, gilding the ocean with perpetual light, a land where the air shimmered faintly, humming with unseen energy, and thoughts could travel farther than voices. That was Lemuria, at least as the Theosophists told it. To Helena Blavatsky and her followers, Lemuria wasn't a place you could find on a map. It was a stage of existence, a spiritual epoch in the long unfolding story of humanity. According to her secret doctrine, Earth had seen many root races, each one more advanced or more fallen than the last. And before Atlantis, before us, there had been the Lemurians, the third great race, halfway between gods and humans. They lived, she wrote, on a vast southern continent that stretched across the Indian Ocean, connecting Madagascar, Sri Lanka, and Australia. It was a tropical world of colossal plants, steaming jungles, and volcanic mountains. Their cities were made not of stone, but of crystal and light. Their temples gleamed with strange geometry, circles within circles, spiraling upward like frozen sound. Their towers pulsed faintly as if alive. But the most fascinating thing, according to Blavatsky, wasn't what Lemuria looked like. It was what its people were. They weren't human in the way we understand it. Their bodies were soft, almost translucent, immense. Shadowy giants, she called them, 10 or 12 feet tall, moving slowly and gracefully, breathing not air but spirit. They didn't speak because they didn't need to. They thought in color, in tone, in vibration. They were the first to sense the divine within the material, the halfway beings between earth and heaven. And yet, even paradise decays. In the theosophical myth, the Lemurians eventually fell. As the earth cooled, their vast continent began to tremble and crack. Volcanoes belched fire into their perpetual dawn. And the Lemurians themselves, once radiant and spiritual, became more physical, more embodied, trapped in a way in the very materiality they had transcended. Desire and greed replaced harmony. Crystals dimmed. Mountains sank, and the sea rose to reclaim what had once been divine. But Blavatsky didn't mourn their fall. She believed it was necessary. The slow descent of spirit into matter, the grand pattern of cosmic evolution. Lemuria wasn't just a lost continent. It was a metaphor for humanity's own loss of innocence. We were, in her words, the descendants of the gods, fallen into flesh. If this sounds strange, remember, it was strange even in her own time. Victorian Europe loved its science tidy, its theology structured, its mysteries manageable. Blavatsky's cosmology blew all that apart. It was science fiction before science fiction existed, mythology rewritten for a modern age. She mixed Darwin and Genesis, Plato and Sanskrit scripture, astronomy and mysticism, and somehow, in the middle of that storm of ideas, Lemuria glowed like a lighthouse. Her followers took it further. Later theosophists like W. Scott Elliott expanded on her visions, publishing The Story of Atlantis and the Lost Lemuria in 1904. He described the Lemurians in even greater detail, their eyes enormous and luminous, their foreheads sloping, their society divided between wise priests and wild primitives. He claimed they discovered fire, invented early architecture, and learned to channel the planet's magnetic currents through colossal stone temples. They were both alien and ancestral, the missing link between myth and history. To modern ears, it all sounds fantastical, almost absurd. But in 1904, it felt revolutionary. Science had stripped the world of its wonder, and here was someone putting the mystery back, giving people a sense that they belonged to something vast and ancient. A cosmic story, not just a human one, and there was something deeply comforting about that. You could look at the sea and imagine that beneath those shifting blue waves lay the ruins of a civilization not unlike your soul, something luminous, forgotten, waiting to be remembered. Imagine standing at the shore under a full moon, the waves folding against your feet. You can almost hear it. The hum beneath the water. The faint memory of a world before time. Maybe it's only the tide, or maybe it's the pulse of something older, still beating far below. That's the genius of the Theosophical Lemuria. It blurs the line between metaphor and memory. Was it real? Maybe not in the geological sense, but in another way. It's real every time someone feels homesick for a world they've never seen. It's real in the way myths are real, not because they happened, but because they keep happening in our minds. And as the 20th century dawned, Lemuria began to evolve again. The mystics had adopted it. Now it was about to go global, no longer confined to theosophical texts or candlelit seances. Lemuria would soon find new believers in psychics, occultists, and even UFOs contactees who claimed not to study Lemuria, but to speak with its survivors. Because as they whispered, the Lemurians didn't die. They simply moved below, into mountains, into myths, into memory. And they were still there, waiting. By the early 20th century, Lemuria had long left the lecture halls of science, but in the quiet corners of the spiritual world it was being reborn, this time as something alive. To the mystics of the 1920s and 30s, Lemuria was no longer a continent beneath the waves. It was a presence, a frequency, a memory of light still vibrating somewhere in the world, and those who knew how to listen, really listen, claimed they could hear it. You can trace much of this revival to a mountain, not in the Indian Ocean, not in Polynesia, but in Northern California. Mount Shasta, tall, snow-capped, and strangely magnetic, became the new spiritual home of the Lemurians. It started with stories whispered by prospectors and travelers, glowing lights at night, humming sounds in the wind, and strange figures glimpsed between the pines. Tall, graceful beings draped in white, their eyes filled with a kind of quiet knowing. They were said to live inside the mountain itself, in vast crystal halls lit by an inner sun. They didn't age, they didn't speak, and they had never died. The tale spread slowly, then feverishly. One of the key voices was Frederick S. Oliver, who, as a teenager in the 1880s, claimed to have been possessed by a Lemurian spirit named Philos the Thebetan. Through automatic writing, he filled hundreds of pages describing an ancient civilization that predated Atlantis, where science and spirituality were one and the same. In his book, A Dweller on Two Planets, published after his death, Oliver described a dazzling society of crystal-powered airships, healing temples, and radiant wisdom. And though it read like fantasy, it struck something deep in people, a vision of human perfection hidden beneath our feet. Decades later, another mystic, Guy Ballard, hiked up Mount Shasta and claimed to have met one of these beings face to face. A tall man in shimmering robes who introduced himself as Saint-Germain. That meeting became the foundation of the I Am movement, one of the earliest modern American mystical sects. They believed the Lemurians were still guiding humanity in secret, gently raising the planet's vibration toward enlightenment. From there, the myth spread like wildfire through the spiritualist underground. Suddenly, Lemuria wasn't a tragedy, it was a promise. In the mid-20th century, as flying saucers filled the sky and atomic fear filled the headlines, Lemuria's legend evolved again. It became a sanctuary, a utopia untouched by war and greed. Contactees, people who claimed to receive telepathic messages from higher beings, spoke of Lemurian masters living beneath the Earth's crust, operating ships of light and maintaining Earth's energetic balance. It was Atlantis without the arrogance, Eden without the fall, a civilization that had chosen wisdom over power, retreat over destruction, and in some ways, that's what made the Lemurian myth so enduring. Atlantis had always been a cautionary tale, hubris punished by nature, but Lemuria was something gentler, sadder, more hopeful. It wasn't destroyed because it sinned. It simply sank, quietly, gracefully, like a candle extinguished at dawn. Its people didn't die, they transcended, and maybe in some invisible way they were still here, whispering through dreams, music, or the silence of mountains. Imagine that for a moment. The idea that somewhere, beneath your feet, an ancient world is still humming, waiting patiently for humanity to remember itself. It's comforting, isn't it? A kind of spiritual gravity pulling the restless modern mind back toward something lost and luminous. By the 1960s and 70s, Lemuria had become an icon of the New Age. Crystals, channeling, Atlantis, starseeds, it all wove together into a tapestry of cosmic nostalgia. Writers like Shirley MacLaine and later countless YouTubers and self-proclaimed ascension teachers would echo the same message. The Lemurians were the ancestors of lightworkers, souls reincarnated to heal the planet. They lived in us, they whispered through us, and they waited for us to awaken. Even today, if you visit Mount Shasta, you'll find small shops filled with quartz towers and violet flames, and locals who will tell you, softly, sincerely, that the Lemurians are real. They might not live in caves or wear robes anymore, but they still walk among us, disguised as ordinary people with extraordinary calm. They'll smile faintly as if they remember something you've forgotten, and they'll say, "We are all Lemurians in a way." There's a quiet beauty in that idea, even if you don't believe a word of it, because at its heart, the Lemurian revival isn't about ancient continents or psychic messages. It's about yearning for peace, for balance, for a world that never lost its way. It's about the hope that somewhere deep down, beneath all the noise and progress, there's still a piece of us that remembers how to live in harmony. And that's the secret of Lemuria's immortality. It's not a place we can find on a map. It's a mirror, a reflection of what we wish we still were. The ocean might have swallowed the land, but not the dream. Dreams are lighter than water. They rise and drift and wait for someone else to remember. It's easy to dismiss Lemuria as just another fairy tale, another Atlantis, another story built on wishful thinking and bad geology. But let's be fair, the line between myth and science isn't always as clean as we pretend it is. In the 19th century, science didn't kill magic. It accidentally fed it. Every new discovery, new fossils, new lands, new species, made the world feel both larger and stranger. Darwin's theory of evolution, the unearthing of lost civilizations, the first dinosaur bones, all of it suggested a planet far older and more mysterious than anyone had imagined. And somewhere in that age of curiosity, A few small mistakes and a lot of imagination created a continent that never was. Remember, Lemuria wasn't invented by mystics. It began with the sober, sensible attempt of a zoologist to explain how lemurs, yes, those big-eyed, chirping creatures from Madagascar, had somehow ended up in India too. Philip Sclater's reasoning wasn't bad. He just lived before we understood continental drift. He looked at a map and imagined a bridge of land connecting the two regions, a continent now swallowed by the sea. He called it Lemuria, after the lemurs who had inspired the thought, and that was that. A scientific footnote quickly forgotten, except it wasn't, because in that one act of naming, Sclater had done something dangerous. He'd put a ghost on the map, and once something appears on a map, even briefly, it becomes real to someone. Maps are spells of authority. They tell us what is and what isn't. And so when cartographers copied Sclater's idea into atlases and textbooks, Lemuria began to live, quietly, invisibly, in the collective imagination. Science would move on. By the mid-20th century, the theory of plate tectonics explained everything Lemuria had tried to. Continents drifted, collided, split apart like slow-moving puzzle pieces across the surface of the earth. No need for sunken land bridges, no need for a missing continent. Case closed. But the thing about myths is, they don't care about closure, they care about meaning. And meaning doesn't die just because evidence disagrees. Even today, geologists still find traces of lost fragments beneath the Indian Ocean, chunks of ancient continental crust nicknamed Mauritia. They're not Lemuria, not in the mythical sense, but they prove that the earth does swallow and reshape itself over time, that continents rise and fall like slow, breathing giants. And maybe that's all people ever needed to hear, that beneath the water, something once stood and could again. It's also worth remembering that science and spirituality often chase the same feelings, just with different tools. Wonder, connection, the search for order in chaos. To one person, Lemuria is plate tectonics. To another, it's the place their soul remembers before history began. And maybe both are right, in their own ways. Because whether we call it Lemuria or Mauritia or nothing at all, the ocean still hides its secrets. Sonar maps reveal trenches deeper than Mount Everest is tall. Volcanic ridges stretch for thousands of miles unseen. Entire mountain ranges, plains, and valleys lie buried beneath black water and silence. We know more about the surface of Mars than the floor of our own planet. So when someone dreams of lost cities under the sea, are they really wrong? Or are they simply dreaming a little too close to the truth? Imagine for a moment the slow churn of the ocean floor, the grinding of tectonic plates, the slow upward push of magma, the collapse of ancient shelves. A continent disappears not in an instant, but over millennia. Its jungles drowned, its temples turned to coral, its stories scattered among migrating tribes who will one day call it myth. By the time the water settles, no one remembers the name, just the feeling that something vast was lost. That's the shimmer where science meets myth. It's not about evidence or belief. It's about how humans process mystery. When we can't explain it, we ritualize it. When we can't see it, we imagine it. And when the world feels too chaotic, we tell stories that make it whole again. Maybe Lemuria was never a real place, but it represents something that is real, the human desire to belong to an older, wiser, more harmonious world, a world that understood balance, a world that didn't need to conquer because it already had enough. So yes, the scientists will tell you that Lemuria never existed, The mystics will tell you that it still does in another dimension, and between those two statements, somewhere in the quiet space between disbelief and wonder, that's where the legend lives, in that shimmering divide. As night deepens and the ocean hums softly beneath the stars, it's comforting to think that both sides are right in their own way. The scientist looks into the water and sees geology. The dreamer looks into the same water and sees memory. And the ocean, it reflects them both. If you listen carefully late at night, you can still hear it. Not in sound, but in suggestion, the faint hum of something half remembered, like a dream you can't quite place. That's what Lemuria has become now. A dream we keep retelling, reshaping, refusing to let die. Long after scientists erased it from the maps, Lemuria refused to vanish. It slipped quietly into new forms: spiritualism, mysticism, and modern folklore. Like a ghost too stubborn to rest, it began haunting the edges of New Age thought. By the early 20th century, Lemuria wasn't just a lost continent anymore. It was a lost paradise, a civilization of peace, wisdom, and light that supposedly existed before Atlantis. A world where beings lived in harmony with nature, mastered telepathy, and glowed faintly with inner radiance, as if sunlight still lived in their skin. The Lemurians were said to have been tall, graceful, gentle, closer to the gods than to man. And when their world began to sink, they didn't die. They simply moved on, descending deep beneath the earth or retreating into the higher planes of spirit, waiting for humanity to remember them. It's the kind of story that sounds absurd until you realize it was never really meant to be taken literally. It was meant to comfort, because every culture that tells stories of a golden age, a lost homeland, a sunken world, they're not describing geography, they're describing grief. A grief so old we forgot what it was for. In a world where progress feels like loss, where modern life hums but never rests, the idea of Lemuria offers a strange kind of relief. It whispers that once upon a time, things made sense, that we were connected to each other, to the earth, to something larger, and maybe, deep down, that connection still waits to be rediscovered. You can see the ghost of Lemuria flickering everywhere once you start looking. In the crystalline New Age stores of Sedona and Mount Shasta, where people meditate under pink quartz towers, claiming to channel the Lemurian light. In spiritual retreats where attendees are told their souls come from the Lemurian line, ancient teachers reborn to guide humanity back to balance. Even in conspiracy theories that tie the lost continent to alien civilizations, secret technologies, and portals under the Pacific, it's easy to laugh at all of that, and yet there's something strangely touching about it too, because underneath all the wild claims and glowing crystals lies a single, simple truth. People still need meaning. They still crave stories that make them feel small but not insignificant. That's what Lemuria has become, a myth of belonging. When Helena Blavatsky and the Theosophists reimagined the story in the late 1800s, they weren't just inventing fantasy, they were writing scripture for the modern age. A new cosmology for a world that had outgrown its old ones. The Industrial Revolution had stripped the earth of mystery. Science explained too much, too quickly, and so people began looking backward into myth, into mysticism, for something that science couldn't give them, a sense of the sacred. Lemuria filled that void perfectly. It offered a story of origin that wasn't tied to sin or punishment, but to evolution and light. It made humanity ancient again. And unlike the jealous gods of older religions, the Lemurians didn't judge. They simply waited, patient and serene, beneath the waves or within the mountains, until we were ready to remember. Of course, the modern world didn't stop there. As spiritual movements splintered and multiplied, Lemuria became a blank canvas for whatever meaning people needed most. For some, it was an ecological Eden, proof that humanity once lived in perfect balance with nature. For others, it was evidence of advanced technology lost to time, Atlantean energy grids, crystal power, and harmonic frequencies. And for others still, it was personal, a metaphor for spiritual awakening, for remembering who we were before the noise began. It's a kind of mythological recycling, each generation turning Lemuria into a mirror for its own longings. The Victorians used it to imagine a noble prehistory. The Theosophists turned it into sacred origin. The New Age movement made it a map of the soul. And maybe that's the true magic of it all, the way a single lost continent can reflect the changing tides of human hope. Take Mount Shasta, for example, a snow-capped volcano in Northern California. It's been called the American Himalaya, a spiritual magnet for seekers and dreamers. According to local law, the Lemurians fled there as their continent sank, carving vast tunnels beneath the mountain where they still dwell, ageless and luminous, waiting for the rest of us to evolve. You can still find people who swear they've met them, tall, gentle figures robed in white, walking silently through the forests, vanishing into light. It's easy to dismiss, sure, but it's also strangely beautiful. The idea that some part of paradise survived, that it's still watching, still hoping. And in a way, isn't that what all myths do? They watch us, they wait, they follow us through time, whispering reminders that we used to believe the world was alive. Because that's what Lemuria really is, a memory of a living world, not a dead one, a world where mountains spoke, oceans listened, and humanity wasn't a conqueror, but a participant. We may never find ruins beneath the sea, but we can still feel that ache, the longing for a time when the earth felt sacred and we still knew how to hear it. So maybe the last light of Lemuria isn't underwater at all. Maybe it's in us, in the quiet, intuitive knowing that we've lost something ancient and kind, something that technology can't replace, something we can still glimpse when we stand at the edge of the sea at dusk, watching the waves shimmer like glass and wondering what's beneath. The ocean doesn't answer, it never does, but it hums, softly, endlessly. And maybe that's enough. Because if you listen closely, it almost sounds like breathing. And in that rhythm, in the inhale of waves and the exhale of silence, you can almost imagine Lemuria again, its spires rising faintly in the mind's eye, its people walking through jungles of impossible color, its songs drifting upward through the water, echoing in the bones of whales and the pulse of tides. A memory, perhaps, or maybe, just maybe, a promise. As you close your eyes, think of that ocean, endless, eternal, patient. Think of all it's seen, the continents that rose and fell, the civilizations that tried to outlast time. Lemuria may have never existed on the map, but in the landscape of longing, it's still very much alive. And as the waves murmur softly in the dark, it's hard not to feel that maybe, just maybe, the world we lost was never beneath the water at all. It was within us, waiting to be remembered. Chapter 4. The Memory of Water, What Remains of Lemuria. Take a breath And imagine the surface of the sea at dawn, silver and still, the horizon blurring into the sky so completely that you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. That is where the story of Lemuria lingers, between what we can prove and what we can only feel. For more than a century, scientists, mystics, and dreamers have argued about this phantom continent. But by the mid-20th century, the tide finally turned. The Earth, it turned out, was not static at all. It moved, slowly, inexorably, like a living thing rearranging itself over millions of years. The continents were not fragments of lost lands, but puzzle pieces drifting on molten seas beneath their feet. It was elegant, logical, terrifying in its scale. And in that moment, Lemuria dissolved, not with a splash, but with a sigh. When geologists discovered plate tectonics, the world became mobile. Continents collided and tore apart. Mountain ranges rose, oceans opened. What once seemed impossible, that India had sailed north from the Antarctic and slammed into Asia, became the key to understanding everything. Philip Sclater's missing bridge between Madagascar and India wasn't a vanished paradise. It was a misread clue. The fossils he saw were not evidence of a drowned world, but of the slow dance of continents themselves. Yet there's a poetic irony in that discovery, isn't there? Because science, in correcting the myth, only deepened its beauty. It told us the Earth really does remember, just not in the way we imagined. The sea floor holds scars, like wrinkles in the skin of the planet. Every ridge, every trench, every island arc is a line in a diary written in basalt and salt. The continents themselves are drifters, survivors of ancient collisions, carrying the ghosts of older worlds in their stone. So maybe Lemuria wasn't wrong, just misplaced. Maybe the instinct behind it was right, that the ocean hides memory and the Earth forgets nothing. Modern oceanographers have mapped almost every inch of the ocean floor now, a feat that would have sounded like science fiction to the Victorians who first dreamed of Lemuria. What they found was even stranger than myth, a world of mid-ocean ridges, hydrothermal vents, and mountains taller than Everest, hidden under miles of crushing dark. Volcanoes still breathing, minerals forming like alien coral, entire ecosystems thriving without sunlight. If an ancient civilization had ever built cathedrals there, they would have long since been swallowed and remade into new rock, their memory encoded in pressure and heat. But the mind resists letting go so easily, because the sea, vast, unmeasured, indifferent, still looks like the kind of place that could hide a secret. When you stand on a shoreline and watch the waves fold over themselves, it's hard not to imagine that something once stood there, waiting to be found. The ocean gives us everything: food, weather, rhythm, myth, and asks for nothing but our humility. And that's what Lemuria became, an act of humility disguised as hope, a way of saying, we don't know everything. There might be more. Even after sonar, satellites, and seismic sensors proved the continent's movements, the public never truly stopped searching, because the myth had become emotional truth, a story about remembering, not mapping. If you look at old globes, you can still see faint pencil marks, the outlines of continents that never existed, scribbled by hands that believed they did. Those cartographers weren't fools. They were dreamers in an age when the world still held blanks. And in a strange way, they were right to dream. Because beneath the Indian Ocean, there actually is a buried microcontinent, a fragment of crust called Mauritius, discovered in 2013. It's not Lemuria, No temples, no towers, just grains of ancient zircon older than the ocean itself. But it proves that even myths can have geological shadows. So yes, the earth forgets slowly. Sometimes it remembers through science, sometimes through story. Both are valid languages if you listen long enough. Imagine now the deep sea floor, black as ink, silent except for the hiss of vents and the low groan of tectonic plates. Each movement there is a word, each quake a syllable. It's the planet speaking to itself in slow motion. That's the real memory of water. Not mystical, but physical. An ocean that carries both our myths and our data, our reflection and our proof. And when you realize that, it feels almost sacred, because in correcting our fantasies, science didn't kill wonder, it magnified it. It showed us that the truth of the earth is more astonishing than anything we could invent. Continents move like sleepwalkers, mountains rise and dissolve like dreams. And somewhere in all that motion, humanity imagined Lemuria, a name for the ache of wanting the world to feel whole again. So the next time you hear the word myth, don't dismiss it as falsehood. Think of it as intuition searching for evidence, a soft voice in the human mind whispering, something is missing, find it. And sometimes, if we listen carefully enough, we do. The ocean will keep whispering that truth back to us, wave after wave, a reminder that discovery and dreaming are not opposites, but reflections of the same desire to see beyond the horizon, to remember what the earth already knows. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine looking down through a window of clear blue water. Light scatters and bends, turning the surface into glass. Below, something vast and geometric glows faintly in the haze, steps maybe, pillars, a shape too deliberate to be natural. You blink, and it's gone. That moment of doubt, that flutter between seeing and imagining, that's where the story of modern Lemuria begins, because even though science had explained away the myth, the ocean refused to cooperate. It kept offering temptations, ruins that weren't ruins, patterns that looked too perfect, stories that sounded too old to ignore. Take, for example, the Yonaguni Monument off the coast of Japan. In 1986, a diver named Kihachiro Aratake stumbled upon what looked like an underwater city. Massive terraces, straight angles, and broad platforms rising from the seafloor. The stone seemed cut, not carved by time. There were steps leading upward into nothing, pillars standing like the ghosts of vanished halls. When photos surfaced, the world gasped. Was this the proof every lost continent myth had been waiting for? Geologists, of course, were quick to answer. They said Yonaguni was natural, the result of sandstone fracturing along horizontal and vertical planes. The ocean does this all the time. It creates the illusion of architecture. But the mind doesn't care about geological logic when confronted with symmetry. We see intention in pattern because we're wired to find design in chaos. It's comforting, even when it's misleading. And so, while scientists explained stratification, others whispered about Lemuria. Japanese mystics called it Mu, the same lost land that theosophists once claimed stretched across the Pacific. They said Yonaguni was a remnant, a corner of that forgotten civilization where temples once rose from coral and gold. Divers returned again and again, finding new shapes, new alignments, new reasons to believe. The truth, as always, lives somewhere between sonar and story, because even if Yonaguni is a trick of geology, it has become something more, a shared hallucination, a physical altar to humanity's need for connection with the deep past. And when you see it through a diver's mask, lit by beams of sunlight slanting through the blue, you understand why we keep believing. It looks like a city that forgot how to breathe. The same patterns echo across the world. In India, just off the coast of Gujarat, lie the ruins of Dwarka, the golden city of Lord Krishna. Local fishermen had spoken of it for centuries, describing lights under the waves and stone pillars glimpsed through shifting sand. When marine archaeologists began excavations in the early 2000s, they found man-made structures 6 miles offshore. Walls, streets, artifacts, all buried beneath silt. Carbon dating suggested some of them could be nearly 9,000 years old. If true, that would predate the Egyptian pyramids by millennia. Scholars debate the accuracy, of course. Sea levels rise and fall. Civilizations rebuild atop older ones. But again, the details hardly matter. The image endures. A sacred city swallowed by time, remembered only in dreams and scripture. And beneath those waves, it's easy to feel that old, familiar pull. The sense that the ocean is less an eraser and more a keeper. That maybe nothing we build is ever truly lost, just waiting for someone to dive deep enough to find it again. The same whispers come from the Indian Ocean near Mauritius and Madagascar, where fragments of continental crust, dubbed Mauritia, were discovered beneath volcanic rock. The zircon crystals found there are nearly 3 billion years old. No temples, no ruins, no architecture, but still something that shouldn't exist where it does. Proof that the earth does hide lost pieces of itself. Science calls them microcontinents. Myth calls them memories. And maybe that's all Lemuria ever was, an echo of the planet remembering its own shifting skin. Still, the legend keeps surfacing, generation after generation wrapped in new names. Sometimes it's Atlantis, sometimes it's Mu, sometimes it's the city of the golden sun, or the 7 cities of Antilia, or even the undersea pyramids said to hum beneath Bermuda. It doesn't matter what we call it. It's the same ache, the same need to believe that there was once something greater beneath the waves. There's a kind of loneliness in modernity. We have satellites, submarines, drones, sensors, but mystery still feels like a necessity. We crave it, because without it, the world feels too small. The myth of Lemuria stretches that boundary again, widening the horizon just enough for dreams to fit through. When you think about it, that's what every submerged ruin represents. Not proof of a lost continent, but evidence of how far back our imagination goes. Before the internet, before the printing press, before even language, we still looked at the sea and wondered what it was hiding. That instinct is prehistoric, encoded into us like the memory of gills. If you stand at the edge of the ocean and stare long enough, you'll see it too. Not the ruins, not the temples, but the feeling that there's something down there that remembers you. That's the real power of Lemuria. Not as a map, but as a mirror. And so, as science lights up the ocean with sonar and satellites, we keep returning to the same question. What's left for the imagination when the world is fully mapped? Maybe that's why the myth never dies, because the deeper we probe the sea, the more it reminds us of ourselves, vast, unknowable, and mostly hidden. The ruins at Yonaguni, the drowned walls of Dwarka, the forgotten crust of Mauritia, they're not evidence of Lemuria, they're evidence of longing, the kind that refuses to fade, even in the face of logic. because while truth satisfies the mind, mystery nourishes the soul, and Lemuria, whatever it was, remains the ocean's favorite secret, one it keeps telling in the language of waves and shadows. The story of Lemuria should have ended with science. It should have sunk quietly into the sediment of disproven ideas like phlogiston or spontaneous generation or the belief that the sun revolved around us. But it didn't. Instead, Lemuria began its second life, not beneath the waves, but in the clouds. This time, she was reborn in the language of mystics, mediums, and dreamers, not the explorers of oceans, but of consciousness, because even after maps had filled in the blank spaces of the earth, there were still blank spaces inside the human mind, and the myth of Lemuria, vast, beautiful, forgotten, offered a kind of home for those inner oceans. In the early 20th century, long after theosophy had woven its tapestry of root races and cosmic evolution, new voices began to whisper again. They said the Lemurians had never vanished at all. They had merely moved underground, deep beneath Mount Shasta in Northern California. It's an odd location for a lost continent to resurface, isn't it? Not under the sea, but under a mountain. And yet, Mount Shasta has always carried an atmosphere that invites belief. It stands alone, snow-capped and massive, piercing the sky like a monument to another world. Even if you don't believe in myths, standing there in the silence, you feel something ancient moving under the surface. The wind sounds like whispering. The light seems too pure. It's easy to see why people think a secret civilization might live there. The story began in 1899, when a writer named Frederick Spencer Oliver published a book called A Dweller on Two Planets. He claimed to have received the text through automatic writing, dictated to him by a disembodied Lemurian spirit named Philos the Tibetan. The book described crystal cities beneath Mount Shasta, powered by radiant energy and ancient wisdom. Lemurians, he said, were tall, graceful beings, survivors of the old continent who had transcended human limitations. They wore flowing robes, communicated by telepathy, and guarded secrets of spiritual technology far beyond our understanding. The book was half science fiction, half sermon, and entirely mesmerizing. It laid the foundation for a myth that would grow with every generation. Soon others followed, spiritualists, wanderers, mystics, each adding their own details. One man said he met a Lemurian on the mountain who handed him a glowing crystal. Another claimed to have entered a hidden doorway that led to a golden city called Telos, where the Lemurians still live in peace. They say the air there hums with energy, that the streets are made of translucent stone, that the people are immortal, watching humanity's chaos from below, waiting for the day we become wise enough to rejoin them. It's beautiful in its way, this belief that something perfect survived the flood, that wisdom doesn't die, it just retreats until we're ready. And though science would scoff, there's something deeply human about that kind of hope. It's the same impulse that builds temples and writes poetry. The desire to believe that knowledge, love, and meaning are eternal. By the mid-20th century, Lemuria had been fully absorbed into New Age philosophy. It was no longer a lost land, but a metaphor for enlightenment, a realm of higher frequency, where consciousness itself shimmered like light. Channelers began to speak for Lemurian beings. They shared messages of peace, ascension, and balance with the earth. Crystals, particularly those from Mount Shasta, were said to hold Lemurian codes, ancient information locked in light. People claimed that if you held one, you could remember who you were before history began. Even now, if you visit the mountain, you'll find shops selling Lemurian seed crystals, long clear quartz with faint horizontal striations said to contain stored memories from before the Great Flood. You'll meet hikers meditating near its base, trying to feel the pulse of Telos beneath their feet. And if you listen closely, you might even hear the low hum of wind through the trees, mistaken for the singing of the hidden city below. Of course, skeptics point out that there's no evidence of any underground civilization, no tunnels, no relics, no anomalous energy signatures. But the believers aren't concerned with evidence. For them, Lemuria isn't a location, it's a frequency, a state of consciousness that predates civilization and waits patiently for us to rediscover it. The lost continent beneath the waves has become the lost continent within ourselves. That's the quiet magic of myth. It evolves to fit the century that needs it. What once explained fossils now explains feelings. What once filled gaps in geography now fills the hollow in the human spirit left by modernity. Lemuria didn't drown. It adapted. It traded coral temples for crystal ones and oceans for inner space. And so, from India's ancient tales of Kumari Kandam to California's shimmering Mount Shasta, the same melody plays, the yearning for an origin that was peaceful, wise, and pure. A civilization untainted by greed or war. A world where spirituality and science were one and the same. Maybe that's why the myth survives, because it gives us something history can't, a place untouched by failure, a world not ruined by ambition, but preserved by it. The dream of Lemuria is, at its core, a dream of redemption, that humanity, once whole, can be whole again. And when you think about it that way, it doesn't matter whether Lemurians live beneath Mount Shasta or in the pages of an old theosophical book. They live in the same place all myths do, just under the surface, waiting to be remembered. If you ever visit that mountain, stay until nightfall. Watch how the last light slides across the snow caps and turns the air gold. Listen to the silence. It's the kind that feels full, not empty, like something ancient is breathing quietly beneath the ground. You might not see any glowing beings or crystal towers, but you'll feel it, the same hush that has followed this story for centuries. The sense that the world is deeper than we remember, that beneath our feet and maybe within our minds, the lost continent still waits, dreaming. Water remembers. That's what some scientists say, and what poets have always believed, not in the literal laboratory sense, though some still try to prove it, but in the deeper, more human sense. The idea that water carries memory, that every wave, every droplet, holds the faint echo of everything that's ever happened to it. And if that's true, then the oceans themselves must be vast, liquid archives, billions of years of memory swirling in silence. The laughter of dolphins, the songs of whales, the thunder of ancient storms, the weight of drowned cities, the slow crumble of continents, and maybe, somewhere in that infinite murmur, the ghost of Lemuria still drifts, a pattern too subtle to measure, but too beautiful to forget. When we talk about Lemuria now, we're no longer talking about a place. We're talking about an idea, a mirror we hold up to ourselves and to our longing for something we lost without ever knowing it. Because the myth of Lemuria isn't about the past, it's about the ache for connection. It's about the wish that somewhere once humanity lived in balance with nature, in harmony with the stars, with the sea, with each other. And maybe that's why it never goes away. Science buried it, philosophy redefined it, mystics resurrected it, and still it lingers, like a song you can't unhear. like a dream that fades when you wake, but leaves behind a feeling you can't explain. Every era rediscovers Lemuria in its own way. The Victorians imagined it as a lost cradle of life, a missing puzzle piece of evolution. The mystics reimagined it as a paradise of crystal light and telepathic beings. And now, in the modern world, it survives as something quieter, a whisper in meditation music, a symbol in spiritual circles, a metaphor in climate essays about loss and renewal. Lemuria has become an ecosystem of meaning, a coral reef of memory and imagination, where facts and feelings entwine. Maybe that's what myths are for, not to explain the world, but to soften it, to remind us that mystery is still allowed, that not everything can or should be proven. If you could look down from space and see the Earth not as land and water but as story, you'd see a glowing network, myths like constellations, connecting places and people who've never met. Atlantis, Mu, Avalon, El Dorado, Shambhala, Lemuria, each one a light flickering in the fog of human memory, each one saying the same thing in a different voice. There was once something beautiful. We lost it, but maybe we can find it again. And in that sense, Lemuria is still with us, in the way we dive into the unknown, in the way we stare at sonar maps of the ocean floor, half hoping to find ruins, in the way we keep searching for wisdom beneath the noise. Because what we're really looking for isn't a continent, it's meaning, something unbroken, ancient, and pure. Imagine standing on the edge of the sea now, the waves folding in slow rhythm, moonlight trembling across the surface. You close your eyes, and the sound becomes a kind of language, one older than speech. You can almost hear it, temples rising, cities sinking, the heartbeat of civilizations long gone. The hush that follows when a world exhales. Maybe the ocean isn't hiding Lemuria, maybe it's keeping it safe. Holding it the way a mother holds a child who fell asleep too soon. Waiting for the right moment to remind us of what we've forgotten, that the earth is alive, that memory runs deep, that we are all connected through time like waves across a single sea. And so, as the night deepens and the world grows quiet, let the idea of Lemuria drift through your thoughts like a tide. Let it carry you back, not to a map or a theory, but to a feeling of wonder, of stillness, of belonging to something older than history. The ocean hums, the stars blink slowly above it, and for a brief moment, everything seems to remember itself. Lemuria was never just a lost continent. It was, and still is, a reflection of our hope that somewhere beneath all the noise, there's harmony waiting to be rediscovered. Maybe that's what we mean when we say the memory of water. Not science, not myth, just the quiet persistence of beauty. Something that refuses to sink. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine the waves folding endlessly against forgotten shores. Temples of coral and gold asleep beneath the dark, the ocean dreaming of its own reflection, and in that dream, a soft voice whispering through the deep, not lost, not gone, just waiting. Sleep well, traveler. May your dreams remember what the world forgot. The story of Lemuria, like the tide, never truly ends. It just withdraws for a while, softens into silence, and waits for the next dreamer to rediscover it. Maybe that's why it feels so familiar, not as a place, but as a pulse, something that hums quietly beneath the surface of our collective mind. When you listen to the ocean long enough, When you let its rhythm take over your breathing, you start to understand why myths like this exist, because they sound exactly like waves, slow, repetitive, soothing, yet impossibly deep. Every swell a rise of hope, every crash a memory of loss. Lemuria is not a continent you can find on a map. It's the shape of longing itself, the yearning to return somewhere better, simpler, purer. Every civilization invents a version of it, a garden before the fall, a city before the flood, a time before noise and neon. It's nostalgia for something humanity may never have had, but desperately wishes it did. That's what makes it beautiful, and a little sad. In a way, Lemuria never drowned. It just changed form. It became the spark behind our myths, the shimmer on the horizon of science, the whisper in every story about Paradise Lost. It became an idea that somewhere perfection once existed, and that maybe, if we listen carefully enough, it's still out there. Tonight, as you lie here listening, the world is quiet again. The same moon that once shone over ancient oceans still spills silver across the waves. The same stars that watched over Lemuria still glimmer overhead. The same water that once touched its shores may be touching your skin right now, in a rainstorm, in a river, in a glass by your bedside. So take a deep breath, feel that connection, the slow rhythm of a planet that's been dreaming for billions of years. You are part of it. You always have been. Let the story fade like a distant tide. Let your thoughts scatter like seashells along the shore. The ocean is calm now, and so are you. If you're still awake, take a moment. Where are you watching from tonight? Let me know in the comments. And if these journeys through lost worlds help you rest, you can subscribe for more. Not for excitement, but for quiet wonder. Because that's what the Sleep Atlas is really about. Finding calm in curiosity. And as your breathing slows, imagine Lemuria once more, not as ruins, but as light beneath the sea, temples glowing softly in the dark, the world asleep but remembering. Sleep well, traveler. The waves will keep their secrets until morning.